Many mountain bikers will tell you that a good pair of tyres makes all the difference, and they're one of the best places to upgrade your bike, especially for riding in winter. To find out which work best, I've been testing 10 really aggressively treaded, tough winter tyres over the last few months. This is taking into account weight, ride characteristics, rolling resistance, and of course grip. You can find a full list of all the tyres we tested in the video description. In order to test the tyres as objectively as possible, I first wanted to measure everything that I could. First I weighed them all, and then I pumped them up to the same pressure on the same rim and measured the exact width using a vernier gauge. This was particularly interesting as the width that's quoted on the sidewall of most tyres is way off the actual width. It's normally much narrower. Part of the reason for this is that manufacturers sometimes measure their tyres at something ridiculous like 50 or 60 psi. We measured them all at 25 psi because that was about what we used for testing. I then measured the softness of the rubber using a durometer gauge. That way you could compare the tackiness of the compound between tyres. With these data noted down, it was time to hit the trails. I tested each tyre with 25 psi in the rear and 23 psi in the front. I tested tubeless as well so that you could check for burping and any sealing issues. This also allowed me to get a better feel for how the tyre interacts with the terrain without the interference from an inner tube. So these pressures are a little lower than I would typically run, but that allows me to get a better sense of how the tyre deforms over rough terrain. It also brings any issues with burping or squirm in the tyre to the surface. Having said that, these pressures are not far off what I would normally run for slippery conditions. I started with a roll down test to gauge how draggy the tyres are. For each tyre I rolled down the same fire road in the same way 3 times and took the average time. As I found out when testing plus tyres for a previous video, rolling resistance can depend a lot on what surface you're testing them on, so this is only a rough guide. Then it was time for some proper riding. I did multiple runs of a trail I'm really familiar with, then swapped tyres and repeated for the most direct comparison possible. I did this with each of the 10 tyres. I repeated this on 4 or 5 different trails, including steep chutes, loose rocks, mud and roots, and a lot of flat corners too. I did time these runs to help gauge how well the tyres carried speed down the trail, but I didn't want to rely on these times too heavily because they could be unreliable. Taking all of these things together, along with of course the price, this is what I thought of each of the tyres in order, starting with my least favourite. So the Continental Kaiser Projekt is a really grippy tyre, especially under braking. The black chili compound works well getting grip out of roots and rocks and what have you. However, the Projekt 6-ply casing is very wooden and stiff. It's very unyielding and harsh over rocky terrain. Feels like your fork is 6 months overdue a service. So you might want to go down on pressure to compensate, but we found that even with 25 psi in the rear, I managed to rip the tyre clean off the rim. The Continental Baron has the same problem in hard and rough ground, but it's more of a mud tyre, and actually it works really well in the mud. It clears well and it finds good grip in soft ground. But once the trails dry out, you're going to find the same problem with harshness over rough ground. It also rolls quite slowly, so it's not an all-round tyre, but if you know you're going to be riding in the mud, it works pretty well. Mavic Charge Pro XL has kind of the opposite feel. It's very compliant over rough ground, it feels very comfy. However, in slippery off-camber situations, it's a bit of a lightweight. It doesn't dig in and find good grip. It's also surprisingly slow rolling considering the levels of grip on offer. We tested WTB's Vigilante tyre using the tough casing, which is a really thick puncture-proof casing. It works very well on the rear, especially in rocky ground because of that. In 29er form, you can only have the hard, fast-rolling compound with the tough casing sidewall. And this, whilst it is definitely fast-rolling, it was one of the fastest rolling tyres here. It's very treacherous on wet rocks because of that hard compound. It gets good, predictable grip in loose corners, especially flat corner situations too, because it has a nice round profile. Bontrager's SE5 was the fastest rolling tyre on test, but also manages to have good grip in kind of wet and soft conditions, as well as on rooty hard ground because it has quite a nice soft compound. The only thing we didn't like about it was that it's very puncture prone. When running it on the rear, in rocky ground, we've very often suffered punctures with this tyre, even running tubeless. The Maxxis Minion DHF is an absolute classic, which works pretty well on the rear as well as the front. It's got a nice rounded profile which works particularly well if you've got wider rims, because otherwise the tyre can become too square. And this rounded profile on our fairly average 25mm rims gives a really nice predictable feel through flat corners. While other more square tyres seem to scrub off a lot of speed in flat corners, the rounded profile of the Minion allowed it to really carve through those corners nicely, and it was one of the fastest tyres on our flat corner test track. However, at 2.25 inches wide, it's a lot narrower than claimed for an alleged 2.5 inch tyre. Also, the EXO casing is quite thin and underdamped, so it pings off of roots and rocks more than we'd like. Also, the centre tread is not the best under braking. It seems to lock up easier than other tyres. The Maxxis Shorty is probably the best mud tyre here. The conical, well-spaced tread blocks shed mud better than anything else and dig really well into soft and muddy ground. So if you're just going to ride in the mud, this is probably the tyre to go for. However, it's very narrow at just 2.1 inches wide, and that EXO casing again feels a little underdamped, so it's very pingy and unpredictable, a bit sketchy on rocky and rooty rough ground, especially if you're trying to attack hard. Having said that, Maxxis EXO casing has proven relatively puncture proof, and it's actually one of the lighter casings on test, so that's the trade-off that you get between good amounts of damping for rough terrain control and a lightweight tyre. Now we're into the top 3 of my favourite tyres in this test, starting off with the E13 TRS. This comes in 2 compounds, the TRS Plus and the TRSr. The TRS Plus is the more sort of all-round compound, but it's still one of the softest compounds on test. The TRSr is by far the softest compound on test. This makes it a superb choice for wet, rocky and rooty ground, where it delivers pretty much unparalleled traction. However, it was one of the slowest rolling tyres on test because of that soft compound. It's also more expensive and is likely to wear out faster. Even the slightly harder TRS Plus compound delivers really good traction in the rough. That's partly because of the carcass, which is one of the wider carcasses on test. It's a solid 2.3 inches wide, and it's really nicely damped as well. For a sub 1 kilo tyre, it feels almost like a downhill tyre. Even on our relatively narrow 25mm rims, they come up a bit too square for my liking. This means that on flat corners, when you're at a really high lean angle, they feel a bit grabby and unpredictable. Also, they seem to scrub off speed more than other more rounded tyres. They're also not the best in the mud, but for rough, rooty and off-camber trails, they provide superb levels of traction. They also have a really nice, well-damped and tactile feel on the trail. Specialized Hillbilly grid is quite similar to the Maxxis Shorty in design and appearance. However, it's not quite as good in the mud. It doesn't clear quite as well. The blocks aren't quite as well spaced, but it's still one of the best mud tyres here for sure. Where it has an advantage over the Shorty is in the rough ground. It's a tiny bit wider, and by our measurements, the compound is a little bit softer too. But the main difference is the grid casing, which feels a lot more damped over rough ground, so it doesn't bounce as much off of rocks and roots. It stays a bit more stuck down. So it's more of an all-rounder. It's good in the mud, and it's pretty good on rough, rocky terrain as well. Despite this all-round good grip and mud capability, it's actually surprisingly one of the fastest rolling tyres on test as well. But what really makes the Hillbilly stand out is the price. In the UK at least, it's markedly the cheapest tyre here at £35 a tyre, which is not much more than half the price of some of the tyres on test here. My personal favourite tyre of this test was the Schwalbe Magic Mary SuperGravity in the TrailStar compound. It may not clear mud quite as well as the Shorty, but this is not a mud-specific tyre. It works well in mud, really well, but it also works well in dust, sand, gravel, roots, rocks, the whole works. It manages to find a lot of grip in pretty much all conditions. The TrailStar compound is not the softest, but the blocks are really heavily siped. That means they have deep grooves in them, which helps the blocks spread out and find really good grip on rocks and roots and hard surfaces. But what really sets this tyre apart is the carcass. At 2.35 inches on the dot, it's the only tyre that measures up to what's printed on the side. It's also, by quite a long way, the widest tyre on test. This particular tyre uses Schwalbe's SuperGravity casing, which makes it one of the heaviest tyres on test, but we think it's a sacrifice worth making. The SuperGravity casing uses really stiff and well-supported sidewalls for the bottom half of the tyre, meaning it's really stable at low pressures and doesn't squirm too much in hard cornering loads. Meanwhile, the top of the tyre is much thinner and more supple, which means less rolling resistance and better compliance over rocks and roots and what have you. I think this is a really good compromise between a downhill tyre and an all-mountain tyre, because those really stiff sidewalls allow you to run low pressures without too much squirm, whilst also slowing the rebound of the tyre after you hit a really big bump, which gives that stuck to the ground, well-damped feel. It also feels nowhere near as wooden as some of the other thick casing tyres on test, meaning much less fatigue on your hands. So this tyre certainly isn't light, and it's not cheap either, but it's surprisingly mid-pack on rolling resistance and offers superb grip in virtually all conditions. I've tested it in the mud, roots, rocks. I've even tested it in the dust and rocks of Italy. It works really well everywhere. No one tyre will be perfect for every rider, but the tyres towards the top of our list we feel have a better balance between grip and rolling resistance and weight and price. And picking one of these tyres that strikes a balance that's perfect for your needs can be a really worthwhile upgrade. One thing to take away from this is that the tread pattern is certainly not the be-all and end-all of a tyre. It actually has less influence on both rolling resistance and grip than you might expect. And what becomes really important is the carcass and the compound, which have a huge effect on the traction and the comfort and the rolling resistance of the tyre, particularly in rough ground. Obviously I knew this was going to be a factor before I started, but it's only when you ride them back to back that you realise how much of a difference it really makes.